Once we get the Snyder Cut and we're officially past the early days of the DCEU, hopefully this should be a dawn of a new era. What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to my channel and another installment of my DCEU review series, where I'm covering all the films in the DCEU I haven't reviewed yet. I'm doing half of them now, leading up to the Snyder Cut, and the other half leading up to the Suicide Squad. I already discussed Man of Steel, and today we're talking about Batman vs Superman: Dawn of Justice. Before we begin, let me know in the comments what your thoughts on Dawn of Justice were if you've seen it already. And make sure to hit that thumbs up button if you like these reviews, as it helps me out immensely by getting my channel out there. And if you're new here, I hope you consider hitting that subscribe button so you can stay up to date with reviews of new releases, older films, hidden gems, and so much more on a near daily basis. But let's not waste any more time and let's talk about Batman vs Superman: Dawn of Justice. This takes place not too long after the events of Man of Steel, where the general public is concerned over having Superman, played by Henry Cavill, on their planet, and letting Batman, played by Ben Affleck, pursue the streets of Gotham. While this is happening, a power-phobic Batman tries to attack Superman. Meanwhile, Superman tries to settle on a decision, and Lex Luthor, played by Jesse Eisenberg, the crime mastermind and millionaire, tries to use his own advantages to fight the Man of Steel. So, a couple of things. One, this is going to be a spoiler-filled review, as there are elements towards the end of the movie that we'll need to discuss, so if you haven't seen this by now and want to know nothing, this is your spoiler warning. Two, just so you know, for the sake of transparency, when I rewatched this for the review, I saw the Ultimate Edition, which, if you're not aware of what it is, it adds 30 minutes to the film and clears up a few plot points. My general thoughts on the film aside, I'd say if you're going to rewatch this movie, go with the Ultimate Edition, as it's essentially the same movie, just with more coherency added to it. As far as my actual feelings on the film, Ultimate Edition or not, they're more or less the same, and let's get into it. This is once again directed by Zack Snyder, with a screenplay by David Goyer, which was partially rewritten by Chris Terrio. And while it was announced right before Man of Steel was released that we'd get a follow-up, it was announced afterwards what exactly it would be. And to give you an idea of what the state of superhero movies were at the time, Man of Steel was released a year after The Avengers, which was, up until that point, the biggest superhero team-up movie ever, and the culmination of 5 movies worth of world building. And while DC had at this point stuck to standalone superhero movies, mostly either of Batman or Superman, with the occasional experiment like Green Lantern thrown in there, Marvel was in full swing constructing their iconic cinematic universe that we all know now. Iron Man 3 had just been released before Man of Steel, sequels to Captain America and Thor were on the way, movies focused on then lesser known heroes like the Guardians of the Galaxy and Ant-Man were in production, and they were mapping out their plans for the next few years, with all those movies I just mentioned being released by the time this was out. And while this wasn't anything officially said, it's very obvious DC was caught with their pants down and wanted to play catch up, and they wanted to cover as much ground as quickly as humanly possible. It may have not been the reason officially listed, but I mean, it's pretty clear. There were no talks of an official cinematic universe until like days before Man of Steel's release, and it was stated Warner Brothers was fast-tracking this follow-up. And not only did we get a follow-up, but unlike the early days of the MCU where it started off with a few solo projects, the next 3 out of 4 DCEU films were team-up movies, with all of them being the first time a lot of these characters were seen in a live-action film, some of whom audiences weren't all that familiar with beforehand. So it was pretty obvious what they were trying to do. And that leads to this film being just all over the place. I wouldn't say it's god-awful, as a lot of people were saying at the time, but it's a bit of a mess, because it tries to do multiple things at once. It tries to be a continuation of what Man of Steel established, especially going on about all the destruction caused at the end of that last movie, which audiences melted down over, and then it also tried to be a compelling story about, as the title suggests, Batman fighting Superman. Plus, it tries to be a Justice League prequel. Like, there are elements in here that were clearly just added to set up the Justice League, like that horrendous Flash cameo in the middle of the movie. It just felt so shoehorned in with a very cringeworthy presentation that I just still can't get over it. And then there are other scenes like the introduction of Gal Gadot as Wonder Woman, who's severely underdeveloped here compared to her solo movie. And then there's the scene where Bruce is looking up files on metahumans, and we get a second brief cameo of the Flash along with Cyborg and Aquaman through security footage. And going back to the term cringeworthy, I'd say that describes a number of things here beyond that first Flash appearance. One thing is the ending, where we get that really terrible Martha moment where Batman decides to stop fighting Superman when he realizes both their moms have the same first name.
Why did you say that name? Martha, why did you say
I get that it tried to make Batman understand Superman more and see his more humane side, but it just comes off so laughably cheesy that it's hard to watch it with a straight face. And another cringeworthy element throughout this entire movie is Jesse Eisenberg as Lex Luthor. Now, I'll be clear. I have no issues with Jesse Eisenberg as an actor. In fact, I think in general he can be really funny, plus he's given his fair share of compelling dramatic performances. But the shtick he goes for here just doesn't work. And to be clear, I was willing to give the guy a chance going into this. I get that in the age of The Social Network, in which he also obviously starred, the idea of a young tech genius isn't something totally unheard of, so while I was initially thrown off by Lex Luthor being reimagined as this quirky, eccentric millennial, I still wanted to judge this version of the character on his own merits. And I think with a better script, Eisenberg maybe could have pulled off a solid portrayal of Luthor, but it always felt like to me he was playing Lex Luthor here in the style of Heath Ledger's Joker. I mean, the haircut's similar, he has a lot of very quirky mannerisms, he likes making quips, he tries to do this balance of being eccentric, laughing his way through everything while also being menacing. It's another one of those things that I don't think was ever explicitly said, but that's all I could think of while watching him. And it just didn't feel natural. I'm not saying Eisenberg's incapable of expanding his range, but this very forced, super giddy, but still trying to be menacing shtick just didn't work. I will say, it was a nice attempt at some levity, considering how dark this movie can be, more on that in a second, and a lot of his dialogue tends to have this cryptic, overly philosophical vibe to it, where he'll express an idea, and he always tries making everything seem bigger than it actually is. Like he tries to give even the most mundane lines a little bit of flair, and when he says something truly of consequence, he'll really lean into those dramatic pauses, and I just couldn't buy it. It comes off as very forced to me. Speaking of being philosophical, this also generally leans into a lot of religious symbolism for most conversations revolving around Superman. This talks a lot about the need for Superman, his intentions, his relationship with the people, how they view him, how he's seen as this god, and nearly everyone from Luthor to Batman to Alfred, played by Jeremy Irons, to a senator named June Finch, played by Holly Hunter, who's leading the investigation into Superman, all have at least one moment where they say something that's supposed to be reflective and discuss morality, or something of that nature. But the thing is, none of the dialogue really stuck with me. A lot of it really was not substantive and felt like word salad a bit. It's nothing that really made you think. I'd say maybe it was more in the way they delivered the line that made it seem like it had much deeper meaning to it. I don't know, but a lot of it's really vague and characters just asking questions. And despite two talented screenwriters handling this one, I really didn't find much of the dialogue all that memorable, other than the really bad ones, unfortunately. I'd also say that despite the heavy religious and philosophical moments, it's not a hope-filled movie. It mostly just feels very dark and depressing. Like Man of Steel, it tries going somewhat for that Nolan style, but it leans too much into that dark and gritty trope that the Dark Knight trilogy inspired, rather than adding elements that felt entertaining or exciting or eliciting any sort of emotion other than just wanting to beat you down. This criticism was also directed at Man of Steel at the time, but as I said in my review of that, while there was a tragedy there, part of the journey involved trying to escape that tragedy and trying to move towards something brighter, even if it was presented with that Nolan-style darkness looming over to a degree. However, I rarely got that from this film. It's just scene after scene where you're meant to just feel depressed. There are a handful of moments here and there that are the exception to the rule, but I wouldn't say I had this optimistic outlook by the end. Though despite my criticisms for the film, I wouldn't call it horrendous. It's certainly watchable, and there are some good elements to it. For one, I thought Ben Affleck was a great Batman, and with the right screenplay, he really could have excelled in the role. I also thought Henry Cavill once again did a pretty solid job as Superman. I thought all the action scenes were well done, including the opening, the first time we see Batman in action, the actual Batman and Superman fight, as well as the scene towards the end where they team up with Wonder Woman to fight Doomsday, who Lex Luthor unleashes on the world. It also moves a lot faster than I was expecting it to, mainly due to these performances, as I was interested to see where they'd go with these characters. And I'd say the first half hour to 45 minutes were actually not bad, but just because it moved quickly doesn't mean it added up to anything emotionally satisfying, because the final product, original or ultimate edition, still felt severely underwhelming due to its clunky, disjointed narrative, and the fact that it couldn't really pick a lane to stick with. I mean, other than maybe Lois Lane. For a film that's 2.5 hours, or 3 hours if you're watching the Ultimate Edition, it's shocking how so many elements felt severely underwritten. And while the first act wasn't bad, everything just fizzles away by the end. Like, this had Doomsday of all characters, one of the more threatening villains in all of DC's canon, and he's just a generic, one-note, hideous monster. I wasn't impressed when we first saw him, and in fact, I really wasn't impressed with the film as a whole, which is a shame, considering this should have been a much more iconic first meeting for these characters. Dawn of Justice is certainly watchable, but I wouldn't call it good. It has some solid elements about it, including Ben Affleck and Henry Cavill's performances, along with some entertaining fight scenes, but the film leans way too much into its dark and dreary elements and attempts to mask it with unsubstantial philosophical statements that end up not really having much to say. It has a poorly written villain in Lex Luthor, on top of the fact that it tries to be a follow-up to Man of Steel, its own narrative, as well as a prequel to the Justice League all in one, and it just leads to an underwhelming experience. Batman vs. Superman, Dawn of Justice gets a 5 out of 10. So up next, I know Suicide Squad is chronologically the next film in this universe, but I'm saving that for the batch of films I'm reviewing closer to The Suicide Squad, since it's a little more appropriate to cover then, and it's not really as necessary to cover leading up to the Justice League, so bear with me, we are going to come back to that, but next we're going to go to Wonder Woman instead. So stay tuned for that, and much more, coming soon. So let me know, did you see Dawn of Justice, or are you planning to see it, and what were your thoughts? Did you like this one at all, or was it one of your least favorite DCEU films? Let me know in the comments below so we can discuss. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please like it and share it, and for more movie reviews and film discussion, please make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated. Thanks for watching everyone, and keep having fun with film.